On this episode of Ask Jason, we will explore whether or not we can actually truly stop the mind. One of the most frequent questions that I get is whether or not we can stop the mind. And today I have a question from Bruce. Now, Bruce says, "Hi Jason, is it truly possible to stop the mind? Or does it just persist and become more silent as we develop in our spiritual practice?" Now, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but you can never stop the mind. Now, when we are introduced to spirituality, particularly Eastern spirituality, there is an emphasis on stopping the mind, so to speak, or the cessation of mental activity. Now, I think a lot of teachers within Eastern spirituality are a little bit clumsy in how they word this sort of knowledge, and they use interesting terminology to explain it. But today I want to clarify those sentiments. And as I said, you truly cannot stop the mind. But what can happen is, through our spiritual practice, is our mind can become more quiet and we begin to experience silence more as our operating system as opposed to the vrittis in Sanskrit, the whirlpool of mind, the mental activity, disturbing our awareness. Now, part of meditation and self-inquiry in the East is to somewhat make a distance between the mind and the pure awareness. And this is where people get confused because they continue to identify with the mind, the mental activity. As I said, the vrittis, the constant whirlpool of activity that we have in our mind. Now, as we all know from living, obviously, is that when we are really busy or when we're watching too many things or when life is kind of overwhelming, our mental activity is very high, very fast, and it kind of distorts our perception of reality, and it's hard to really be grounded and to be calm when you are in that sort of state of consciousness. And so when you apply meditation or self-inquiry or other practices such as Tai Chi Chuan or Hatha Yoga and other spiritual practices, one of the core reasons we practice is to make the mind quiet so we can begin to have a sense of the oneness of reality. You can't have a sense of the oneness of reality when your mind is just jittering like this. It's like a bad caffeine rush when we're in that state of consciousness. So it's about making the mind quiet. It's not about stopping the mind or ceasing the mind, or you will hear teachers say killing the ego. I mean, the ego still persists, but your practice begins to down-regulate the volume of the ego. So you're turning down the volume and it's not overpowering your pure awareness. And that's the problem that we have when we begin to engage in spiritual practice, is there's this big tug of war between your pure awareness and your mind, which is accustomed to doing things a certain way. But when you begin to practice meditation, you're trying to quieten the mind, you're trying to abide as pure awareness, and you then begin to see the mental activity for what it is. It's just like waves on an ocean. And so the more you practice, the more your mind becomes quiet and the more you appreciate silence over agitating your mind with frivolous nonsense and noise. And that's what I find strange with a lot of spiritual aspirants, because I can tell sometimes their development when they're still attracted to a lot of noise and a lot of activity, their mind hasn't truly become quiet. You can see this in someone's life. But when their mind has become quiet, you appreciate more silence. You appreciate just sitting quietly, sipping a tea and maybe reading a great text or something of this nature, rather than turning on Netflix or scrolling the Facebook feed. And so what happens deeper in the practice is once the mind becomes quiet and you have a resonance with silence, then that's when you can develop a distance with the mental activity. This is what the teachers should be actually talking about. It's not that you stop the mind, the mental activity still goes on, but you develop this distance from the mental activity because you're abiding more in your pure awareness, in the witness perspective, and you're seeing it for what it is, which are just waves on an ocean. And so when you begin to dissociate with mental activity, then you are not reactive to the mental activity. And this is, again, another thing that people find in the beginning of their spiritual practice. They are still reactive to their mental activity. They get in the Facebook feeds and they start disagreeing with someone and so forth and so on. But if you had a distance with your mental activity, then you would not be so reactive. And that's what, in some sense, I find difficult sometimes running social media, because I can tell when people are reactive. I can put an innocent post up about something and someone will misconstrue that post or misinterpret it. And then I have to try and explain to them what it's actually about, which actually is a little bit frustrating, because some of the posts I put up are very simple and they're not really anything to get too confused about and to get too mad about. So it's just a post. It's an innocent post and you can just move on. And so that's the difference, right? It's about having that distance with that mental activity. Once you have that distance from that mental activity, you're not reactive. So this is how you, quote unquote, stop the mind, but it doesn't stop necessarily. What has stopped is your reaction to the mental activity. That's what should be taught by some of the teachers who talk about stopping the mind or ceasing the mind. It's about stopping your reaction to the constant activity within your mind. And so, yes, you can, in some sense, stop your reaction to the mind, but you can't stop the mind's activity itself. It continues to go on. That's just the nature of the mind. But when you practice, you can begin to down-regulate your ego to make the vrittis quiet, and you begin to then come into resonance with the silence that is at the heart of our being and at the heart of the universe. So what could be more important than that for a peaceful and sane and healthy world?